I'm head of the office of the Fridrih Ebert Stiftung in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and really excited of being a part of this interesting conference. And before I like to make some hopefully short opening remarks, I would like to say thank you to, especially to Tanja Topic. She designed the program from our side, and to be honest, she did the work, not me. So Tanja, once again, and of course also to our cooperation partners, to all our speakers, thank you very much. We like to reflect upon remembrance, forgetting, denial, with a special view to monuments and memorial spaces in the culture of memory. And you have really no idea how close and important these topics are for me personally. Because my deep conviction is, without honest and sometimes really painful remembrance, there is, at least in the long run over generations, no real democracy. When we remember the past, this has much more to do with ourselves today than with the past itself. When we talk about the past, when we build monuments, when we build memorial places, we in fact always talk about ourselves today, about how we want to live together today, about our current values in a political sense as well as in a personal. But as human beings, we tend to forget. And we tend to think first of ourselves, to see ourselves innocent or as the real and only victims. Being from Germany, okay, for example, in Germany, it took more than 2 generations until the crimes against humanity arrived in public memory, in monuments, in memorials. Before that, the victims of the German genocide had no voice and no place. And that's a lack of democracy. And of course, the work is not done. It never can be finished. There are still so many gaps and refusals in our public memory. And we will hear from one example today, the so-called Poland Monument. But although I would like to, I don't want to talk about Germany, and I don't want to give any lecture here. I like to participate, to learn with interest and excitement. And just some few words. Of course, we would all prefer to be together in real life today in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in fact, in Brčko. And it would be nice to discuss and deepen our subject face to face, of course. But to be honest, after 6 months of this pandemic, I can no longer hear the complaints about the impossibility of analog events. We as Fridrih Ebert Stiftung tried in the last 6 months, tried out a lot of new things. We reached more people, new target groups. We had to change our thinking and our formats of political education, and that's a lot of advantages for us too. Just one example. Do you think we would have had such a great international group of smart and, by the way, also good-looking people coming to Brčko at the same time as they are gathering right now, right here in front of your Zoom screen? So let's be happy that we are together here and now. And the discussion is important. That's why I shall not longer steal our time. Many thanks to all those who made this possible again and are with us today and tomorrow. Well, stay at home, at least for the next 2 hours, and stay connected right now and in the future. Vidimo se, and thank you.
Hvala, Petere. Thank you, Peter, for these kind words. Sada bih zamolio Edvina da nas odbrane, da nas obrati. Edvine, da li se čujemo, da li ste tu?
Čujemo se. Hello everyone, my name is Edvin Čudić and I'm coordinator of Association for Social Research and Communications from Sarajevo. Our organization was founded 7 years ago, and since then we have been working on documenting war crimes and commemorating the victims of Yugoslav's wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro and Serbia. The process of dealing with the past in these countries goes through various stages, from denial to taking responsibility, rehabilitating and celebrating war criminals, and creating denial and creating new policies of remembrance. In achieving their goals, many use different tools, and monuments have proven to be a good instrument in writing a new and different history. Experts from Western Balkans countries will talk about these and other topics And we are especially grateful to them to taking time to participate in this conference. I would also like to take opportunity to thank our partners from Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Thank you for everything you do in our country. This conference should open many questions, but also provide answers on how to deal with the problems of commemoration now and the future in the countries of the former Yugoslavia. I hope that together we will learn new things and that we'll use this online space to provide solutions to issues from our difficult past. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Hvala Edvine, thank you Edwin. Sada bih zamolio Berta Hopa. Bert, are you there? You have to unmute your microphone, please.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, do it again.
Do you hear me now? Hello?
Perfect, perfect. We hear you, please address to us, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I will start this evening to talk a bit about the German problems in commemorating its troubled past, and Tanya asked me to talk about current debates in Germany on commemorating the past and the crimes against humanity in Germany. And I thought that it would be interesting to broaden the topic a bit, or to broaden to look a bit more back in time, because now Germany often is praised for its commemorative practice, for its memorials and its monuments, and sometimes the Germans themselves perceive themselves as the world champions in commemorative politics. But of course, this hasn't been always this way. And therefore, I would like to have a short look into the last decades of the commemorative politics in Germany. Because in the first, especially in the first 2 decades after the Second World War, the Germans didn't perceive themselves as the main perpetrators of the Second World War, but rather than among the main victims. And this is also clearly expressed in the monuments you can see in the German cities. And I take now a closer look on the monuments and memorials you find in the German capital of Berlin, which is, of course, and the most exceptional city where you can find these monuments. The most striking memorial you find in Berlin, which commemorates the victims of the Second World War, is the former Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche, the ruin right in the center of West Berlin, where you find the ruin of the tower of the former Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche, destroyed by the aerial bombings during the Second World War. And this tower, these ruins you can find in a lot of German cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and others, commemorating the German victims of the Allied bombing wars. Then you have another very prominent building in the German capital. This is the so-called Deutschland House. This Deutschland House has been dedicated to the German expulsees from the former German territories in the East, which have been annexed after the Second World War by Poland and the Soviet Union. And this also has been the most prominent view to the Second World War. After the Second World War, that the Germans have been bombed by the Allied and expelled from the former Eastern territories, and so the Germans perceived themselves mainly as victims. There were only a few sites in Berlin that also were dedicated to the victims of the Nazi terror. Among them, mainly the memorial to the attempt putsch against Hitler on the July 20th, 1944, in the former Bendler block, so the Reichswehr, the site of the Reichswehr head commander, and the former prison of Plötzensee, where a lot of Nazi victims have been executed. But these two sites were also dedicated to the German victims of the Nazi terror, so the resistance movement in Germany itself. So there were for a long time no memorial sites which commemorated the victims of other nations in Berlin. There was a change in the memorial culture only in the 1980s, when a couple of different sites were commemorating the victims of the Nazi period, namely the memorial to the so-called Aktion T4. This was an action of the Nazi leadership against the mentally disabled persons, which have been killed in the beginning of the Second World War by the thousands. Then the former Gestapo headquarters near the Martin-Gropius-Bau in the very center of Berlin. And finally, the Haus der Wannsee Conference, a villa at the shore of the Wannsee Lake in southwestern Berlin, where in January 1942, the heads of the German ministries have discussed on how to kill as many Jews as possible. All these memorials were founded in the years between 1968 to 1966 to 1968. And tellingly, most of these sites have, before they have been transformed into memorial sites, used for completely different purposes. For example, the former Gestapo headquarters has been used as a dumping site and as a site where you could drive your car without a driving license. The Haus der Wannsee Conference was used as a youth hostel. So, and only with the reunification, there was a real turn in Germany and in Berlin in order to look on other groups of victims, namely a group of victims in other countries. This was mainly the result of a discussion on the reconstruction of the central memorial for the victims of war and terror in the East Berlin city center, the new Guard House, which has been already a memorial for the victims of the First World War after during the Weimar Republic, and which has been then transformed to a memorial to the victims of war and fascism by the communist regime, and after the reunification it became the memorial to the victims of war and terror. But then there were critics who said, well, it is highly problematic to commemorate on one side the victims, the fallen German soldiers who fought in the Second World War, and their victims, the victims of the war of extermination, namely the Jews who died in the Holocaust. And therefore, there was a discussion on the construction of a memorial dedicated exclusively to the Jews who died, the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. The first ideas were developed in 1988, but only after the reunification. There was a concourse, artistic and architectural concourse on it. And in 1999, it was decided to build this memorial, which was then opened in 2005. What is interesting with the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is that it's not only a monument, but it's also a memorial center, because one result of this discussion on this memorial was that it would be useless to build in the 21st century, so to say, a mute monument, only with one inscription to the 6 million murdered Jews, but that it would be necessary to have a memorial site where people can meet and listen to talks, to discuss on the problems, on the history. So, and therefore, a small memorial center was included in the foundation of this Holocaust Memorial, the so-called place of information, Platz der Information. But still, the Holocaust was in the first place perceived in Germany as a crime committed against fellow Germans, in this case of Jewish faith. And only after the reunification, and especially after the end of the Cold War, the whole group of other victim groups came into the attention of the German public, especially in Eastern Europe, which was the main theater of war and crimes, of German crimes. In Poland, in the former Soviet Union, and in Czechoslovakia, and so on, and of course in the former Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And therefore, there have been done a lot of research beginning in the 1990s with the archives in the former Soviet Union now open, which were extending enormously the knowledge on what the Germans did do during the Second World War in the occupied countries, which were occupied by the German Wehrmacht. And one of the main results of this research was a very famous exhibition opened in 1995 on the crimes of the Wehrmacht, Verbrechen der Wehrmacht. This was an exhibition which resulted in an outcry on especially the conservative and right-wing sphere, political sphere in Germany, but which was very important for the development of broader perception of the crimes committed by the Germans during the Second World War. But now there is a dilemma with the commemoration of the German crimes during the Second World War. I talked about the Holocaust memorial in the city center of Berlin, but of course, as I said, the Germans had persecuted a lot more of groups during the Second World War, and these groups becoming aware that there were so many other groups. There was also the Germans became aware that they needed to commemorate also these groups, and the dilemma now is that now we have the problem how to appropriately commemorate all these different groups. There have been erected in the last decades 2 memorials close to the Holocaust memorial, which commemorate first the genocide on the Roma Sinti, which have been killed by 500,000 during the Second World War, and the persecuted groups of the homosexuals, which were persecuted by the Nazi. A rather small group compared to the Jews and to the Roma and Sinti. But now this also shows the main dilemma that you have so many groups that it's problematic how to bring these different memorial sites together. And this discussion on how to properly commemorate these groups have been taken a new start now with the debate on the so-called Polish memorial, which shall be erected in the center of Berlin, right near the Deutschland House, which is dedicated to the German Axis. Again, this so-called Polish memorial has been initiated by a private group. It's a private initiative, so-called a grassroots movement, a group of social actors who said that there is a lack of knowledge on the special fate of the Polish people during the Second World War. Poland has been the first victim of the Second World War. It has been the central theater of war and terror during the Second World War, especially if you think on the extermination camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, which all have been erected on Polish territory, which has been occupied by the German Wehrmacht. But whereas now the Jewish victims are, the Germans are well aware on the Jewish victims, the initiative who wants to build this Polish memorial says that there's a lack of knowledge on the non-Jewish victims in Germany, and that this lack of knowledge sometimes leads to strange statements when people talk, for example, on Polish concentration camps. In most cases, they just mean the concentration camps which have been situated on Polish territories, but it shows that there's not a very high sensitivity on this topic. Then the dilemma now is that the Polish have been in Eastern Europe not the only nation that has been occupied by the Germans. And so some critics have criticized this idea to build a Polish memorial because they say it's problematic to divide the various groups of victims into these nations, and to build a Polish memorial, a memorial for the Soviet victims, or the Ukrainian, the Belarusian, the Russian victims, to the Baltic victims, and for example, to also for that, then there should be also a memorial to the 2.5 million Soviet prisoners of war who died in German captivity. So, and therefore the critics now have made the proposal to not to build just another memorial, but rather a memorial center which is dedicated to the Nazi, to the German occupation policy during the Second World War. And that in this memorial center, one could highlight the fate of the different nations in temporary exhibitions, and to show in the permanent exhibitions the differences and the similarities of the occupation policy in Europe. What is a point of debate, a point in this debate too, is the aim which one should have with such a memorial. Is this a memorial which is mainly built for the German society, so in order to learn about the crimes the Germans committed during the Second World War, or should this be a center for the reconciliation with the German neighboring countries? And up to now, this is one debate which is still going on, and where now no decision is taken, especially as just recently, last week, there has been decided that right on the center where the initiative of the Polish memorial wanted to build this memorial, it has decided to build another museum, a memorial to the people who were forced by the Nazis into the exile, a museum of exile. So, and as a result of my short talk on the problems of the commemoration politics in Germany, is that up to now, the German society is confronted with a lot of dilemmas with commemorating the past, and that the debate is still open and going on.
Thank you very much, Bert. This was very kind. Now, I would like Veran Pavlović to prepare from the University in Rijeka, and we should start with our first panel. Zamolio bi sada Verana Pavlovića iz Sveučilišta u Rijeci da se pripremi da krenemo sa našim prvim panelom. Verane, jeste li tu?
Tu sam, evo.
Bravo, hvala, izvolite.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me to this panel, this conference. I think it's a great collection of scholars, many of whom I know. I see some familiar faces also watching, but also some new scholars. And thanks, Bert, for the introduction, showing us that even in societies where we think like this has been resolved, the memory issues and dealing with the public space and the memorialization is an ongoing struggle. And in the last couple of months, I've been invited to a number of also online conferences discussing the removal of monuments. We've been seeing this happening now in the United States, in the United Kingdom, South Africa, and other places, this wave of monument removals, vandalism, or graffitiing them, and so on. And I've been asked constantly, you know, would you remove the monuments, or do we keep them to continue this discussion debate? And I'm going to not give you my answer right now, because I want to let the panelists maybe comment on them as well. And so we have 4 panelists. Each of them have prepared some kind of introductory comments, little presentation, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll do at least one round of questions. We'll see how things go. And I think it's really great that we're discussing this issue about you know, memorials, their meaning, their potential for reconciliation, the way in which, you know, do we preserve them for eternity, or do we remove them? Do we modify them? Is removing them vandalism? Who gets to decide to remove them? And maybe a bigger, even meta question could even be, you know, why do we even have monuments? Do we just stop with the monuments at all? You know, that's kind of the epic question in a way. Probably it's not going to happen. And I'm just thinking back on the former Yugoslavia, when we've just seen in the 20th century so many cycles of removal. You had end of the Habsburg Empire, they were removed, and then you had during World War II the removal of all these Kingdom of Yugoslavia monuments, King Alexander, etc. Then after the Second World War, with the communists taking power, then the Italian monuments, the German monuments, the monuments from the NDH, etc., then being removed, and then in the 90s yet another wave. So this has been a constant change of monuments. And as I mentioned, it's going on now in the US. And as you may tell from my accent, I've spent a lot of time in the United States. I've been looking at US monuments. And up until a few years ago, I was always saying the Civil War in the US, we've resolved it. It's now an exhibition in a museum, maybe some books, maybe the guy's reenacting it. But it's fascinating to see how a shift in politics, now they become center stage again. Whether it was, you know, a few years ago also with Trump's election, and now with the Black Lives Matter movement, we see them taking on new roles. So they're always waiting there, this memory culture or collective memory. Sometimes it's activated, other times it lies dormant and then becomes activated in different moments. And also with this introductory talk, was a very interesting position. It's very easy for a society to make monuments for its own victims. I mean, I think that's every country, especially those who had gone through a war, of course, building its monuments to its victims, possibly even its victors. But the more difficult thing is to the victims of the other side, or even to one's own perpetrators. And that's the challenge. And we heard that, in a way, Germany is, as my colleague Nicola Moll likes to say, the supermodel of remembrance culture. But even we see that in Germany, this is being, you know, it's a challenging question. So I'll now I'll introduce each of the panelists. I'm going by the order that was sent to me. So Tamara Banjeglav will be our first speaker. And Tamara received her PhD from the University of Graz. She was a postdoc at my university, the University of Rijeka, and worked closely on this project, Framing the Nation and Collective Memory in Croatia. And she works on a lot of memory studies, transitional justice, nationalism studies. She's worked on Vukovar quite a bit, and she's currently an independent scholar. So maybe I'll give the floor now to Tamara. Hello.
Hello. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Vjeran, for the introduction, and thank, of course, to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to, my presentation will actually be a bit theoretical. I will engage in a theoretical discussion about the link between memorialization and democratic values in post-conflict settings, but will also support my presentation with some empirical examples from Croatia and from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also try to answer some of the questions that Vjeran just raised. So I would like to start by asserting that memorialization has become a critical element in current struggles for human rights and democracy. And as scholars of memory studies have already showed, the state plays a prominent role in memorialization practices, whether in defining and emphasizing one dominant narrative or in providing space for different and in some cases even contesting accounts of political violence. However, there are some authors such as Lea David in her really excellent recent book who also argue that memorialization in democratic regimes sometimes mandates normative standards that actually dehistoricize and decontextualize the local knowledge based on the assumption that the standardization of memory is actually an effective means of promoting universalist human rights values. This means that memorialization standards that are prescribed by, for example, experts in transitional justice actually ignore different aspects of identities in local communities. So the question that I see as necessarily arising is, can there actually be a universally correct way to remember past atrocities? And without attempting to prescribe what monuments and memorials commemorating violent past events should or should not look like, I argue that state memorialization should be more aligned with local conditions in such a way that memorials are contextualized, meaning that they provide contexts for what happened at certain sites, and that memorials are also inclusive, meaning that they speak to different social groups. In this way, memorials would be, in my opinion, more congruent with democratic values. The democratic values that I am actually speaking about are, as I just mentioned, inclusion of different experiences and but also possibility for critical reflection about what happened. So in order to analyze different memorials in post-conflict democratic regimes, my colleague Mila Dragojević and I have actually attempted to develop a framework by categorizing memorials into 4 different categories, depending on the extent to which memorials are congruent with the 2 defining democratic characteristics, and those are the inclusiveness of different perspectives and different experiences and a space for critical reflection. So we actually propose to start with memorials rather than the regime type, and then to analyze whether memorials are congruent with these democratic values. So we have divided memorials into 4 possible categories, which I'm going to define now. So if there is a high level of inclusion of different perspectives and the memorial provides space for a high level of critical reflection, then that memorial would be congruent with democratic values, and we would categorize it as pluralist memory. If the memorial deliberately excludes one or more of the groups that were important in the local history for any reason, then even if the memorial provides space for critical reflection, this would be an example of selective memory. Alternatively, if the memorial includes many of the relevant and diverse groups or experiences, but does not provide space for critical reflection, then this would be an example of uncritical memory. And finally, a memorial that both excludes different social groups important for the event in question and highlights only one dominant narrative would be an example of official memory. So I will try to give examples for each of these categories. I will start by giving an example of pluralist memory, and that would be, in my opinion, the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo. So this museum collects testimonials from people from all over Bosnia and Herzegovina about their childhood during the war. And the aim of the museum is thus to offer an alternative conception of group identity based on children's experiences of the war that would be remote from ethnicity as the sole relevant marker of identity. So the inclusiveness of different perspectives in this museum means that different perspectives are subsumed under an umbrella perspective of children whose childhood was severely affected by the war. The War Childhood Museum also contains the element of reflexivity because the visitors are invited by looking at children's items and reading stories behind these exhibited items to relate to children's narratives and to think about their own personal experiences. And in this way, the visitors actually engage with the exhibition in a self-reflectional and participatory way. The museum thus contains both inclusive and reflective elements and can be considered as an example of pluralist memory. Next would be an example of selective memory. And that would be the monument that is erected in Croatia at the site of all mass graves, which are officially marked with an identical monument. So this monument bears an identical inscription that says, in memory of Croatian defenders and civilians killed at a certain date in Greater Serbian aggression on the Republic of Croatia, while the inscription is signed with the Croatian people. This text, however, excludes victims who did not die during the Greater Serbian aggression, but were killed by members of, for example, Croatian army or paramilitary formations. Moreover, the monument gives additional weight to the category of ethnicity and belonging, and is actually thus cementing the category of belonging to one's national group. Due to its rather abstract nature, it does, however, allow visitors to engage with it in their personal way, and it accomplishes the goal of encouraging reflexivity. But since it memorializes only one group of victims, it would be categorized as an example of selective memory. An example of uncritical memory would be the monument to all victims of war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, or the monument, the so-called Monument to Peace in Sarajevo. This is not a very well-known monument. It was actually put up at local cemetery in the part where deceased from all confessions are buried. And the monument is meant to memorialize all those who died in wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as it says on the monument. However, although it is inclusive in terms of memorializing all victims of wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the monument does not provide space for any critical reflection. There is no text on it, so it is actually hard to tell who are all the victims that it commemorates. There was also no public debate about its opening, and it is not the site of any, as far as I know, of any public or official commemoration. So it doesn't actually play any role in the city's or state's culture of memory, and it is thus unclear who, what, and by whom is being remembered with this monument. So it does not fulfill the criterion of reflexivity, which is why it can be considered as an example of uncritical memory. And my last example would be the monument called Store 95, which was erected on the main square in the town of Knin, and it actually falls into the category of official memory. So the monument actually parallelly commemorates and celebrates events from the 1995 military operation Storm in Knin. It is decorated with bullets and with a number of lights which actually symbolize candles for the fallen Croatian soldiers. And on one of the walls of the monument, there is a documentary film that is being screened. The monument also consists of glass plaques which are embedded in the ground in front of the monument, and each of them contains information and figures about the war. However, it fails to mention civilians civilian victims of the operation. So it mostly celebrates the success of the Croatian army in liberating the occupied territory, but does not address war crimes committed against Serbian civilians. So due to its silence about civilian victims and the lack of space for reflexivity, this monument is considered, could be considered as an example of official memory. This analysis, by focusing on memorials rather than on characteristics of a political regime, I would argue that memorials that are inclusive of different social groups and have a space for reflection would be more aligned with democratic values. However, the congruence between the characteristics of the political regime and those of the memorial should not be assumed even in the case of consolidated democracies. Thus, although some democracies can be viewed as young or immature, that does not mean that pluralist memory there is not possible, as the example of Bosnia and Herzegovina shows, just as some old and consolidated democracies can still witness selective and uncritical memory. And to conclude, just as the work on deepening and of democracies is never finished, I would say, so it is the same for memory work, especially in post-conflict societies where memorials also often strengthen and even set in stone the already existing divisions.
Okay, thank you, Tamara, for the very interesting typography or typology of monuments. I think it's a very interesting approach and not the usual one which focuses a lot on like the visual aspects, but this is more about, as you mentioned, also the democratic values of some of them. And I think the potential for reconciliation, you know, do monuments just perpetuate divisions, or can they serve to heal? Maybe Natasha Zupan, our next speaker, could comment on that. She studied Middle Eastern studies and history. She did some stints in Palestine and Macedonia before joining Swiss Peace, and also worked for the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs as an advisor in Bosnia, Macedonia, Serbia, and Kosovo. And since 2004, she's been the coordinator of the working group on peace and development in Germany. So, Natasha, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and good evening. I hope everybody can hear. Okay, because my micro is telling me that it's not working. It's a pleasure to be back again, basically, even though only remote. I've been joining the discussions for a couple of years now, and I was really looking forward to meeting you in Brčko, but okay, that's the way it's going. I think what is really important to note right from the beginning, obviously I'm not a historian, even though I studied it. I'm rather in peace building practice. So my perspective is looking into the challenges of dealing with the past processes. And when I use now, from my perspective, the term politics of remembrance, I rather think about a whole set of measures which of course encompass memorials and monuments, but also education, politics, culture, and media. But still, I'm going to focus on memorials, basically from a local perspective. And I'm glad that I'm not from Berlin, because otherwise I could probably not provide some examples from a different perspective that already did. So I'd like to start with a small story from my hometown, Bonn. It's only like 2 years ago, I visited the memorial site for former Nazi victims. And it's a really small exhibition. It's a permanent one. And at the beginning, you are entering the room, you read about different stories of Jewish victims, citizens of Bonn, and also communists and social democrats. And you move on, and all of a sudden, the picture pictures are changing, the picture frames are different, it's blue instead of white, and the type, the font types of the explanations are also different. And you do not get stories of Jewish victims anymore, but of Sinti and Roma. And then you move on, and again, the format is changing, and yet you get to know more victim groups, and Bert already hinted to this, you know, huge, let's say, variety of different victims groups. They are now commemorated in Germany. And in many respects, this very small site reflects this politics of remembrance in Germany, or for my side, to be more precise, from a Western German Holocaust remembrance politics. So when I go on, I would like to highlight 3 of these aspects. And I think it's important also when we are thinking and discussing, you know, changes in former Yugoslav countries and the politics of remembrance in former Yugoslav countries. So first of all, this small site reflects that, of course, the transformation of politics over the course of time. So this different picture frames and different typos are pretty easy to explain. It's simply the extension of the exhibition over the course of 20 years. So since the exhibition was opened in 1996, they adapted, like every 10 years or every 5 years, they adapted, they added victims groups. And today, obviously, the politics of remembrance in Germany does acknowledge this broad range of victim groups. It also, I think that's also very important when it comes to democratic standards or human rights approaches to memorialization. I think it provides a much more sophisticated analysis, and also it provides more information about the Nazi system. How did it function? Who was responsible? What kind of institutions were involved? But also, what was the role of bystanders, of different social groups, etc. So in the 80s, and we already heard about it, in the 80s and 90s of the last century, the German politics of remembrance basically focused on Jewish victims. And this focus, again, was only the result of a long-term struggle for acknowledgement of Jewish victims, which started in the 60s. During this time, beginning of the 60s, anti-Semitism in Germany rose. And at the same time, let's say this was the generation of not even of my parents. So a new generation anyhow began to struggle and to challenge existing taboos and the silence about the Holocaust in the German society. So I think it's always a struggle, and it's always about challenging existing narratives and politics. And coming to the second aspect, which is reflected in this small site in Bonn, it's the institutionalization of memorial sites. And we already heard we are, you know, the champions of memorialization. And yes, I think Germany is well known for this broad landscape of memorial sites. And I would even challenge this idea of if memorials are integrative and showing different memories, it's more, let's say, it's more democratic. I think it's about finding ways of a pluralistic landscape, which is interconnected. I would rather, from a German perspective, I would rather argue for a pluralistic landscape, which does not necessarily integrate each victim group. So in the 60s, concentration camps, prisons were turned into memorials. We built a lot of museums, we already heard it. We have a lot of memorial or commemoration plaques, and we have Stolpersteine. I don't know if this is familiar. These small little stones in front of houses of former Jewish or citizens who were deported to concentration camps. So you have a everyday surrounding of commemoration and of places of suffering, basically. And this memorial site in Bonn was initiated by local civil society organizations. And I think probably the majority, probably Bert knows better, but the majority of today's memorials started as very, very small initiatives, sometimes of survivors, sometimes simply private persons or church-based organizations. State institutions were not involved. On the contrary, very often these small private initiatives met fierce resistance by local politicians or the local population. So there's one example, it's the concentration camp in Dachau, because after the war, this concentration camp was turned into a refugee camp. And little by little, they built apartment blocks. And obviously, in one of the former camp buildings, they opened a restaurant, which was called by the owner at the crematory. And an already very small exhibition, which was built there, was destroyed and removed by local authorities. So in a nutshell, I think, yes, and we already heard, today's landscape is often maintained and supported by local or federal authorities. But it's the result of a long-term civic engagement and struggle. It's also the result of course, this changing politics of remembrance. And I think till today, these memorials or these museums are a subject of emotions. They are really heated debates, and it's not only about the Holocaust, but it's, for example, whether the German society is allowed to commemorate its own victims. There are conflicting ideologies, obviously, conflicting perspectives, and this is what is ongoing. That's part of a democratization process, and I think I hope this will go on. And last but not least, those sites in Germany obviously must not only adapt their content like the small exhibition in Bonn did, they also need to adapt to new generations and a completely changing, obviously, society in Germany. So these memorial sites and museums face a lot of challenges today. And obviously, first of all, it's about finding a smart answer to the rising right-wing narratives and symbols in public spaces. These right-wing, I don't know, social media, whatever, networks obviously really confront the existing value-based consensus on Holocaust remembrance in Germany, and it's also confronting a specific, I would say, positive value, which is taking responsibility for past crimes in a way that you built a democratic and tolerant society. So this is, I would say, this is one of the challenges we are facing, and we really thought by commemorating never again, this won't happen, but it's happening right now in our society. Those memorial sites also need to, in a way, exactly adapt this, you need to remember. And it should never happen again. It's very ritualized. It's a bit of a taboo also. It's an educational approach which is basically blocking a younger generation of finding their own ways to reflect. Especially when it comes to our today's very diverse society with different cultural backgrounds and of course different socioeconomic backgrounds, and probably a lot of them do not really have any kind of direct link or emotion or whatever remembrance, family stories, when it comes to the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I think what we heard right now in the last hour is what one of a very quite famous professor in Germany called the cult of suffering and victimhood. So what we are right now focusing on, and not only in Germany or not only in former Yugoslav countries, but all over Europe, when it comes also to let's say, mass crime commemoration or Holocaust commemoration, it's this, it's if we stop focusing, if we stop only by focusing on suffering, and we do not provide methods and ways to reflect how a system is driving politics of discrimination, what kind of mechanisms exist to exclude different groups or discriminate different groups. And if we not find ways to explain in these sites how this is impacting also on our values, this politics of exclusion and discrimination. It's, I think, this idea of transforming, learning, and getting engaged in democratic values is a bit problematic. So I would rather argue that we can have a broad landscape. It's becoming more and more difficult to focus only on victimhood and victims. I wonder whether this approach is basically opening ways to reconciliation. And I consider all these places rather as places for democratic learning and tolerance and civic engagement than for reconciliation. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha, for many interesting and provocative ideas about the space and the potential for reconciliation. Our next speaker is Dragan Markovina. He's a historian. And he worked in the University of Split for many years, but he is also a writer and a journalist for many blogs, newspapers, Oslobođenje, Telegram. He's written a ridiculous number of books in the last couple of years. I'm a little bit envious about this production, but okay. He cranks them out. I'll highlight just two of them. One is Između Crvenog I Crnog, Split I Mostar u kulturi sjećanja, where he looks at both Split and Mostar, two cities that are very close to him, and he's observing the memory culture there. And the most recent one, which I haven't had a chance to see, but sounds very interesting, Libanon na Neretvi, kultura sjećanja I zaborava. And he's also been politically active in Croatia. He's organized a number of also summer schools, workshops on democracy, anti-fascism in Zagreb and on Korčula. So hopefully we'll be back in action and meeting live on Korčula at some point in the near future once this pandemic is over. So Dragan, let's hear what you have to say. Your microphone, you're muted.
Okay, do you hear me now? So I would thank you all. I would like to speak about my hometown Mostar today, because in today Mostar we have at least 4 culture of memory which there is no any kind of understanding between those 4 culture of memories. We have the city which is which just he just lived his post-conflict era, in which each national group has its own way of remembering on the war, has its own monuments, own stories, and not single of them is ready to hear the story of the other side. So we have the Mostar is very interesting because it's still a multi-ethnic city. After all, we had Croats, Bosniaks, Serbs, and we had a four group in that city, which is the people who like Yugoslav memory, who maybe are in some way also even and Croats and Serb and Bosniak, but they are anti-fascist. They have a nice memory on the city before the war. So that's 4 groups. Even today, when we have the new elections in the city, cannot speak with each other normally. Croatians had their own, Croatian politics, right-wing politics, made few monuments after the war, of course, on the western part of the city, which commemorates the soldiers of Croatian army in the last war. And not even one of them is in any kind of, to ask some question about the real, maybe the trauma with that soldier made to the other side. On the other side, in the east part of the city, you had a few monuments which the people who try to remember the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina put their own monuments in that part of the city, and all of them speaks the story about brutality of the war, and they are heroes. They are big victim from the Croat army. The Serb in the town are now, before the war, there was about 18% of Serbs. Today is that maybe 4.5 or 4 to 5% of that population in the city, but they are also big Orthodox church were blown away after at the end of the war, and now we have the very interesting situation in where the church, which is now rebuilt again, is also more monument than a spiritual building. It's more. I think that that new Orthodox Church, which is actually the same as it was before destruction, is actually a monument of one national group which lost the war in the city, if we can say that in that way. Also, the Stari Most, that bridge, old bridge in Mostar, which made that city famous during all over the world, and which was destructed from the Croat army, is today more monument than it was. Than it's just a bridge. It's also a monument of remembering the last war. And at the fourth place or five, we have the big partisan monument in the western part of the city, which was made by architect Bogdan Bogdanovic. It was I think his best monument, which remembers the Second World War partisan fight. And it's there every year, almost every month, we have a new destruction on that monument when right-wing groups, Croats, made some. They break the parts of the monument. They put some marks there with the Nazi cross, with the Ustasha symbols and something like that. So we had the very small city, which has maybe 100,000 people lived in Mostar, which has completely conflicted four type of memories in that small space. It's a miracle for me that after that kind of brutal war and after those and in the situation where no one listens the other side, that there is no war again in that situation, and there is and that there is actually some kind of a normal life in the city between the people, and they function together even after all those brutality in 90s. So I think that the monuments, all of monuments in Mostar, like all of the new monuments in, for example, Croatia or even in other parts in Bosnia and Herzegovina, are made for one purpose, made for purpose that no one else after they put the monument can speak about those period, because we put the monument, we have our story of our story, and we don't want to hear any kind of judging about the 90s, about that period. This is the official truth. So we even if we formally turned to democracy in early 90s, we actually don't have democracy. We had at least three official truth, official history, which doesn't like that anyone speaks about dark sides of the 90s and their own roles in the war of 90s, especially if those men or those people who try to do that, those historians, if they are from that nation. They can even tolerate when someone from the other nation said something against that official story, but they are if someone from their nation do that, he had a very, very hard way to live in that community after that. So I'm not an optimist. I think that, and that was the thing which I wrote in my last book, Lebanon and the Narrative, which you mentioned. I think that the best thing we can do now in this kind of situation is to tolerate each other. Just to say, okay, you have a right to have your own memories, give us right to have our memories, and we will not discuss that for some kind of years. I don't know, in which maybe in the future some new people will be ready to speak about it. I think that Spain, after and you know that better than me, had some that kind of okay, we will not talk about civil war, but then it all came back in last years, and it didn't help. But I don't see any other way to go in the future, because we all tried, as people before me said, we all tried to fordeal the past, for talk about it, but it all went in our little circles of the people who already understand the need to talk. But I don't see that the political power and the most of the people are ready to hear the story of the other side, or the third side, or the fourth side.
Okay, Dragan, thanks for a slightly, yeah, as you said, pessimistic view, and the idea how the history is frozen in the memorial space, in the monument, in the statues. You know, the bigger or the less democratic a regime is, the bigger the monument they attempt to make, that forever it tries to preserve it. But you know, monuments do come down. And I thought it was also very interesting what you were commenting, and also as Tamara was saying, we're not really just talking about monuments or as a statue, because you know the Orthodox Church in Mostar also a monument, not to mention the cross on the hill and the church towers, the Catholic Church, etc., the mosques, but also the bridge and so on. And Tamara also mentioned the museum, the Childhood Museum. So we see that these monuments or memorials actually can take on many, many different forms, not just what we maybe think of as a classic monument. And now our final panelist before maybe a wider discussion, Hrvoje Klasić. He's an assistant professor at the University of Zagreb, Department of History. He's works on two very interesting documentary series, Hrvatsko proljeće, which was about 10 years ago, and the eagerly awaited documentary series on NDH. Hopefully they'll be out soon. I know there's been a little bit of a scandal, and that's been going on for quite some time. He's written also a number of books. His most recent one, Mika Špiljak, Revolucionari državnik, just came out. He's also not only a historian, but also a veteran also of the war in the 1990s. So it'd be maybe interesting, you know, as someone who participated in that war, and we've got all these homeland war memorials all over Croatia, you know, how do you want also to see this war to be memorialized? Because I mean, you're, you know, also that's part of your memory. So
okay, good evening, everybody, and many thanks to Fridrih Ebert to invite me on this conference. I will try to leave some time for discussion, although it's not it will not be so possible, but let's try. So my role is today just as historian. I'm not expert in memorialization, in commemoration, or in monuments, but as all of my all of speakers mentioned, talking about the memorialization means talking about dealing with the past process. So it's a wider picture, and talking about dealing with the past, as Vjeran mentioned already, the problem is that people in this region never had opportunity to deal with the past in a scientific, objective way. So since the focus, because of monuments today, is Second World War and the war in 90s, I can just put on the side this pre-war period, but after 1945, so during the communist period, dealing with the past was not objective and scientific process. And of course, during the, or after 1990s, still it's not real dealing with the past. I would rather say that it's always in this region more, it's struggling with the past, it's fighting against the past, and maybe trying to build better past. Through monuments, through changes of street names, through curriculums of history textbooks, everything you all know. So during the communist period, it was maybe expected that there was one official narrative, and that it was ideological, it was selective, and it was tendentious, of course. But and with this black and white narrative, with one official narrative, with good guys and bad guys, and precise goals of historiography, of memorialization and of history teaching. But not all, it's evidential that not all, but a lot of us expected in 90s with the democratic transition that dealing with the past will change in a lot of ways, but it didn't happen. So again, we gain official narrative, official truth about the past, and so the role of history education, role of memorialization, role of historiography was again, or now in a different way, it was to awake emotions of loyalty to the state and nation, to promote national identity, to encourage patriotism, and to show Croatian state as a main purpose and main outcome of all historical development. So we all expected, of course, something different with one multi-perspective approach to history, with a lot of criticism, especially self-criticism, to prepare students and society, but especially students, for citizenship, to help them building open democratic society and prepare them for life in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. But on contrary, the main goals of history, with new memorials and with new narratives, so the goals were and still, I would say, are to foster healthy patriotism among the young and to establish a suitable historical past. And what is really important in this context of how to memorialize victims and perpetrators, and not only our victims, one of the main goals was to present national history as history of Croats. So ethnic minorities were not seen as an integral part of national narrative. So their contribution to national history was, let's say, ignored. So that's very important to know when we are talking about monuments and about changes of monuments in today's. Maybe I didn't stress. I'm talking mainly about Croatia and about the situation in Croatia after 90s. So destroying a few thousand monuments, but also destroying books, changing names of streets. It started in 90s and it lasts till today, and results are revisionism omnipresent in everyday life. And I would say one of the main result, and maybe the most problematic result, is that we managed to normalize not normal things. So today, talking about Ustasha period and a lot of aspects of Ustasha period, but also about crimes during the 90s, it totally shift in totally strange way. So just for the end, because I will try to leave the time for discussion. Yeah, I was in the war in 1991. I was a volunteer, and of course, the problem is that there were many, let's say, types of veterans. Those who continue with their life, socio-economical life, private life, but also a lot of them who stop their life in the war, and it was the only period of their life when they were important in their neighborhood, in their region. So their view on the past is much different than a view of people who continue with their life and who could be critical about events in 90s. So yeah, it's a tough question to talk about that period. But if you have any questions, I will be glad to answer. And now I will go back to Vjeran and give for him maybe for some discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Hrve, for some of the personal reflections on it. Now, I just wanted to ask the organizers, Edvin, should I open it up for anyone to also ask a question, or do I just, am I still in control and let the speakers maybe have one more quick round? Is someone there from the organizer?
If there are any questions, you can open the questions because this is a panel.
Yeah, I think maybe if there's, I mean, it looks like there's, you know, a lot of people paying attention and following this. Maybe they have a question just so they don't, not just me. Does someone else want to ask one of the speakers? Oh, here, there's a chat. In your opinion, how is youth learning about different memorials in their countries? Is the educational system teaching about the truth, or is it subjective? And I think, I guess we can have this for, I don't know if anyone wants to handle this particularly. I also would just have a slight question also for Tamara in terms of your typology, where you mentioned the last one was the official memory, but could an official memory also be pluralistic? I mean, is it possible in a democratic society that it's official and pluralistic as well?
Yes, of course. I mean, it could. It would be ideal for the official memory to be pluralistic. The example that I mentioned, the example of plural memory in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is not the official memory. It is, like, as far as I know, it is not supported or financed by any levels of the government, but even this doesn't mean that the official memory could not be also plural. I think this is the ideal that we should be aiming for. I was talking about the examples of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, but unfortunately I think that in these two countries we don't have a pluralistic memory that would be official at the same time, which of course does not mean that this could not happen in the future. It will probably take a long time, but I think that maybe even this year we can witness some baby steps in this direction.
Does someone else want to address this question about education and youth in memorials? Does someone?
And if anyone who is watching us over the Facebook, you can write on the comments beneath the video, and we will put the questions to you, if that's okay.
I thought that I answered this question with a story about the textbooks and the history curriculums. So in Croatia, for the long, maybe still, it's of course, there is official narrative, and there were discussions about what should teachers teach about the last war, maybe less about the secular war, but about the 90s, it's official narrative. And as one of leading political figures in last few years said once, people can, in their four walls, in their room, they can think what they want to think, but in the school, they should teach official narrative and official Croatian truth. So, yeah.
Any other comments about that? Okay, unless there's a YouTube question, I have a question for the panelists, which is I sort of started the introduction with, which was, we heard a lot of initiatives, we heard very many different kinds of monuments, we've heard about some problems and the challenges, but what happens, what do we do with these controversial monuments? You know, do we blow them up? Do we move them? Do we add something to them? So maybe we could just do a quick go around. Let's hear from Natasha, then Dragan, and then Hrvoje and Tamara. Dragan, you sort of mentioned a little bit of coexistence, but maybe you have a specific answer for this. So maybe Natasha, maybe we can hear from you first. What do you think about this wave of removals? Is it vandalism or necessary removal?
Well, I think there is a nice story for Berlin, where the former headquarters. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Where the former headquarters of the SED, the Socialist Party in GDR, was basically blown up, and now it's rebuilt. You got the castle of the former emperor, which is rebuilt in this place. So from my perspective, it's also official politics, of course, because it's setting a very specific perspective. I'd rather argue that if possible, we try to contextualize what is existing, trying to explain, to put into perspectives, and let people think about it. Blowing it up basically means it's a taboo, and it's an empty space. It does not really help to reflect and to develop this pluralistic view. So I would rather argue for explaining and contextualizing.
Okay, Dragan, what are you? What is your perspective about this controversial monuments? You're muted.
Here, I think that we shouldn't move them because every monument is some kind of the. He was built in some context and some situation. So I think that we should write something at the bottom of the monuments, which will say this is problematic person or some kind of memory. We have the different views on that kind of memory. I think it's much better to put that explanation there and to open the story about that monument and or everything which was connected with it, then just to move it or to blow it up, because I agree, if we blow up the monuments or move them on some far away space, there is no possibility to maybe create a new way of viewing the history.
Okay, Tamara, what do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I also agree that the monuments should not be moved. As I was talking about the democratic values and how the monuments should actually be more reflexive, they should have a component of context. So I think it would be better to contextualize them, to provide more information about what happened and what we are actually commemorating with this monument. So if there is a controversy, that controversy should also be addressed, maybe on a plaque next to the monument or something like that. Because if you remove a monument from a landscape, you are not actually erasing memory. That memory is still going to exist. You are just, if you decide to remove a monument, then you also kind of take monopoly over what is going to be remembered and what is going to be forgotten in public space, but of course not privately. So I think that removing monuments should be should happen only if there is no space, no possibility for public discussion. What should happen first would be a public discussion about what this monument represents, what is being commemorated with it, why is it controversial if it is controversial, and in this way we can actually learn something from history and not just erase it and pretend that it never happened.
Thank you, and Hrvoje, I'll give you the final word in a second, but I just also wanted to comment about also two items that are two aspects that we've just sort of spoken about. You know, sometimes there's so many times monuments can also be invisible, even though they're there, people ignore them, and sometimes they can serve to create discussion if the society has, you know, good education and accountable politicians and so on. And so a controversial monument with additional information could make it visible and allow some kind of debate to go on. And another thing, I think it's important that countries or cities or municipalities or regions also have good laws or regulations about how to build monuments. I think the case was even after World War II or after the wars in the 90s, there was no regulations about monuments. We had all kinds of memorials popping up with all kinds of discourse and texts. You know, it takes years for, you know, what you can write on a monument and how they can be raised. So many of the monuments that were from the first step, very problematic language on them. So, you know, there's, as we've heard earlier also from Natasha, I mean, in education, there's so many other aspects that allow us to understand monument, not just the actual stone in itself. Hrvoje, maybe some thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think I don't have a clear answer, and I think that what Tamara mentioned is the key, the definition of controversy. So what is controversial? So I agree with Dragan, I agree with Tamara and you, maybe with some signs and explanations, but what if it's not possible? I can imagine monuments of Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler or Ante Pavelić after the Second World War. So to leave them there with explanations, they are, or in 90s, monuments to war criminals, and now we'll put explanation and look every day in the heart of the city, some war criminal. Is it controversy or what is it? So I'm not sure. I don't have an answer. You know that in the United States there are huge debates about, especially about the Civil War and monuments, and so the importance is context. When the monument was built, why? So what was the intention of building that monument? Of course, we can discuss about every person. Churchill was great statesman, maybe the greatest of Britain, but also he was a racist and in many ways problematic person. So we can discuss about such persons, but what about clear war criminals or perpetrators or whatever? So I'm not expert, and I'm just a historian, and it's much easy in my book to write something about these aspects, but with monuments, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, memorials and monuments, you know, they're set in stone, literally, and there's often not much nuance, and that's why they're being built. They're built there to say one specific thing, unlike us historians who we get to, you know, we have 800 pages to discuss a topic. I think we're running out of time. I know there's another program. I don't want to go too long. I think we've exactly wrapped up. I'd like to thank all the panelists and the people who were following also on Facebook, and the questions and the organizers. So I assume my job is done here. If the organizers want to take over.
Yes, Sharon.